Nearly 40 years after a 9-year-old girl from Nampa was found dead, the Canyon County prosecutor has formally charged the man detectives say is responsible. 64-year-old David Dalrymple is charged with first-degree murder and rape in the death of Daralyn Johnson. DNA evidence linked Dalrymple to the murder in 2020. Now, almost 2 years later, he's officially been charged. Tristan Lewis spoke with a forensic analyst and researcher. He introduced investigators the tools to tie the evidence back to Dalrymple. Tristan, how does it feel like this case seems to be finally coming to an end, right?
Yeah, so Brian, Greg Hampikin with the Idaho Innocence Project over at Boise State worked with Charles Phan, who was originally arrested and convicted of Daralyn's murder. In 2001, DNA evidence from hairs tested at the crime scene cleared Phan's name. Idaho Innocence Project worked to get him compensation for his wrongful conviction and stint on death row. Hampikin says he isn't sure today's news makes it all that easier for the victims' families and others involved, but he tells me if there is a redeeming part is that somebody who investigators say believes is the true killer is finally answering to that.
The most challenging thing as a scientist, and the reason why people go into science, is because there are mysteries.
In the more than 20 years, the Idaho Innocence Project director Greg Hampikin has been part of forensics biology. He's worked on many different cases, but he says there's been nothing quite like the mystery of who killed 9-year-old Daralyn Johnson of Nampa.
We're so sure that if we just kept going with this, the science would open up. And that's what we kept assuring the investigators. You've got to be patient.
While the murder case dates back to 1982, the Idaho Innocence Project didn't get involved until 2007, when they started working to get Charles Phan compensation for his wrongful conviction.
In starting that, though, we found out that the case had never been solved, that there was DNA from a pubic hair that was left on the poor young victim in this case.
Researchers and investigators were very limited in information while testing the hair because it was without its root.
We were stuck. All we could do was compare whatever samples police would bring us as possible suspects.
That was until a collaboration with a colleague out of UC Santa Cruz, Ed Green, just a few years later, that Hampikin found out a new technique used on ancient DNA that could get them one step closer to helping solve who did this.
You take the DNA from the pubic hair left on the child, you treat it like an ancient DNA, and you get enough information, kind of DNA that 23andMe use for their data. And you go to public databases or other databases and you try to find a last name or a lineage of the person who left the pubic hair.
That data eventually led Canyon County Sheriff's Office to link David Dalrymple to the crime in 2020 and announce formal charges Thursday.
This was a great end to the science part. And Charles Phan always reminds me that we have to always first and foremost think about the victim and the victim's family.
Hampikin is still in contact with Charles Phan, who he describes as a calm and private person. He saw him about 3 months ago and said he looked happy. Hampikin says he is a quiet man who wanted to live a quiet life, and now he's able to do that. Last year in June, Phan was issued $1.4 million in compensation because of the Idaho Wrongful Conviction Act. And Brian, Dalrymple's preliminary hearing is set for January 25th.
This DNA stuff is fascinating, Tristan. As we were just talking about, too, I think this is the same technology they used to catch the Golden State Killer, same kind of process.
Yes, exactly. Same kind of process with that ancient DNA, just tracking it back to where it all came from.
Amazing. All right. Thank you very much, Tristan.